Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Crash F1 podcast. I'm your host, Ian Mangan, and joining me today is, of course, Lucas Cochran. So, racing returned in Zandvoort over the weekend. Oscar Piastri managed to extend his lead in the championship with a flawless win. Meanwhile, his teammate Lando Norris suffered a devastating DNF with just a few laps to go. And rookie Isack Hadjar secured his very first podium in F1 after a very impressive performance all weekend. Well, Lucas, it was a pretty interesting return to F1. What did you make of the Zandvoort weekend?
Well, to be honest, I think this was exactly the return to Formula One that we were hoping for after the summer break. We had a little bit of everything. We had drama, we had hope, we had heartbreak, and I think there was so much action going on, not just at the top of the field, but all the way down it. So I was really, really, really pleased to say that. Obviously, we did have Lando have an engine failure, which was truly tragic, and as the commentator said, it did take some of the sting out of the race. But at the end of the day, that is part of going racing. So I think it was about as good a turnout as we could have asked for.
Yeah, it was a really interesting race. It kind of had a very interesting start to the weekend. There was drivers slipping and sliding all over the place throughout FP1, 2 and 3. A few crashes throughout qualifying and of course throughout the race. Definitely a very interesting race result as well. I think McLaren, we knew were going to come in very, very strong compared to everybody else. But obviously that Lando DNF added to a bit of the intrigue, and there were some really interesting results to kind of go through. So we'll have lots to talk about today. But I mean, guess the first thing we need to talk about is one, what a performance from Oscar Piastri. Secured the Grand Slam, fastest lap pole, and 100% of the laps led throughout the Grand Prix. Just an absolutely flawless weekend for Piastri. Really, really impressive. And then, of course, Lando Norris suffering that pretty devastating DNF with just a few laps to go. He'd had a pretty strong weekend himself. He'd qualified just behind Oscar. I think it was less than a hundredth behind him. So
Yeah.
missed out very, very close. And then, unfortunately, just race ended in tragedy. I mean, this is a pretty big extension of Oscar's lead in the championship. I mean, Lucas, is this the end of the championship? Is this it?
Well, I will not have anything being written off at only halfway through the season, so I'd like to hold out some hope that there's still going to be some competition yet. And yeah, you are right. Oscar put on an absolute masterclass today. I mean, leading 100% of the laps, complete Grand Slam, cleaned house all weekend. So, top tier performance from him. He also said himself that when he needed to, he controlled the race, and he absolutely did. As for Lando, he had a really strong performance on the line this weekend, and it's the same commiserations that his team were giving him over the radio. He was really fast that day, and it is a crying shame that it was decided by reliability issues. But I think there is still plenty of time for him to claw back that difference in points. I mean, it was going into this race, I think the difference was 9 points in Lando's favour, actually. So the gap isn't quite as devastating as it could have been, but there's some serious work to be done. But even still, I'd just like to emphasise that this is Formula One, and at the end of the day, anything can happen over the next 5, 6, 7 races. So I'd like us to just sit tight and hope that, things can change. We never know. God forbid, but one day Oscar's engine might just do the same. Who knows?
Yeah, I think what you touched on there, Lucas, is and a lot of the commentary over the weekend was we hate the idea of seeing the championship being decided on reliability. Oscar obviously has a pretty big lead on Lando now, and Lando does have a bit of work to do now over the course of the next few races. That being said, there's 8 races left of the season, a couple of sprints there. You're right, anything could swing in anyone's favour. Lando as well was obviously very downbeat after the race. His race engineer, Will Joseph, just really trying to give him plenty of encouragement. You were fast, mate, you were fast, what he was saying on the radio, which was kind of an interesting way to try to lift his spirits. I think Lando was downbeat, but fairly not looking to point too many fingers at the end of the race. I mean, McLaren have come out and very much said that this was a Mercedes issue, this was an engine supplier issue, nothing on our end, which is obviously tough to take. We've seen that Mercedes engine has been a little bit unreliable this season too. Kimi Antonelli has had a good few engine failures as well on his own team, but I think Lando took it quite well, didn't really throw any kind of strop or anything after the race, and I think it's impossible to say that he's accepting that, but he'll be able to just move on and be happy with what he could take away from what he achieved on the weekend.
Yeah. I mean, especially considering that usually when he does have a little bit of a crash out, it's generally because it's been him who's at fault. And this time, again, as his engineer has said, it wasn't his fault. There was nothing to do with the team. It was nothing to do with him as a driver. So hopefully this shouldn't knock his confidence in the same way as other incidents have. And I know we were saying a lot last week that sometimes when Lando has a bad weekend, it goes on to affect him in races that follow. Hopefully that won't be the case here because it was very different circumstances.
Yeah, definitely. I think as well, the one thing is that, Lando obviously pulled off some really good moves throughout the race. He lost the position to Max early on. Max had a very kind of interesting overtake on Lando in the first lap. Looked like he was kind of struggling to keep it on the track, took up a bit of dirt, but an overtake is
I
an overtake.
I don't know how he managed to do that. I mean, that from where I was sitting, that very much looked like a mistake that he, by some force of black magic, managed to convert into an overtake. It was completely miraculous. But I mean, at the end of the day, world-class driver. Who am I to judge how he manages to overtake someone? And the fact he made it stick is credit enough in and of itself, right? But yeah, no, it was a very spicy overtake on Lando. But again, another issue that we've usually seen with Lando is sometimes it just takes him too long to convert following into an overtake. Whereas on this occasion, it took him less than 9 laps. He was passed by lap 9, which is a great improvement over what we've seen in the past. And I know this is sort of the bare minimum for a Formula One driver to be able to overtake under pressure, but to do so at Zandvoort with the overtake that he pulled off on the driver he pulled it off on is full credit from me.
Yeah, and it was a really, really impressive overtake, to be honest with you. It took Max on the outside. He was calm, measured. Obviously lost that position to Max, and we've seen in the past where Lando might not have the best opening lap in the races, especially this season and last season. He did actually have quite a good start. I actually felt his start was slightly better than Max and Piastri, but he lost out that position obviously. But he just bided his time, pulled off a really, really impressive overtake, and then was following Oscar pretty much throughout the entirety of the race, which led to a lot of tension. I think obviously there was a bit of a chaotic race. There was little dots of rain throughout, 2 safety cars, as we know, and which meant that McLaren were having to manage that race really, really well. They were doing a lot of double stacking, considering that there was just pretty much no gap between the drivers. However, what I will say is Lando drove really well. I don't think he would have gotten Oscar in those last few laps. I think this was very much Oscar's win still. And unfortunately, I think when Lando misses out on that pole on tracks like this, the odds of him then getting that win seem to just diminish massively unless there's a massive change in strategy or something has cropped up within the race that's kind of out of their control, such as safety cars, things like that. So I think that while Lando had a really, really strong weekend, it just felt like Oscar has proved that this championship is there for the taking with him. I think he just is inching
I
that bit closer.
Yeah, I am inclined to somewhat agree on that front, unfortunately. I mean, we you were saying about having safety cars and the double stacking and all of this stuff. I mean, for starters, McLaren's pits weren't all that great, which was slightly concerning this race, but they were under safety car conditions, so you could argue it doesn't really matter. And then, of course, going back to Oscar versus Lando for a second, we had 2 safety car periods during the course of this race, and under neither of them did Lando manage to pip Oscar at the restart. There wasn't really any real battle that was going on between them after those restarts. And obviously a safety car, at the end of a safety car, the whole field's bunched up. You expect that to be your best chance. And I imagine probably for the first period, Oscar was maybe been sweating a little bit, watching over his shoulder. But by the second, Lando didn't seem to pose any sort of a threat, which I think is a real shame and could go towards speaking to who might walk away with the champ this year.
Yeah, I think that's at the core of some of the problems here. Oscar just seems so in control. He handled every single restart masterfully. He just seemed to have the jump on not just Lando, but everyone else once the entire grid had bunched up behind him. Let's not forget, Max had some serious pace that weekend too, as well, and I think could have been a threat to both drivers at certain points. Now, his pace did drop off substantially then to the McLarens, so I think it was always going to be the McLarens' race to win. But this is a track where we know traditionally overtaking has been quite hard to do, especially with this kind of era of regulations as well. And I think that Oscar just really held his own throughout the weekend. It really was flawless. But speaking of that, obviously we had lots of safety cars. I mean, the first one brought out by none other than Lewis Hamilton. Lucas, we spoke about his
Mm.
struggles at Ferrari at length last week. really disappointing to see his costly crash at lap 24. He had a snap at around turn three. There was a little bit of rain at this point. He ran wide, and just ended his race completely. Really disappointing to see. I mean, Lucas, what did you make of the whole situation?
Yeah, listening to him down in the media pen immediately after the incident, it didn't really seem like he had much of a grasp on what had gone wrong. A lot of people were putting it down to rain on paint, which I guess is a possible outcome. But for a driver as experienced and as skilled as Lewis, especially to have as much proven prowess in the wet as he does, being one of the best drivers on the grid in the wet, historically speaking, to see him drop it under what is, very, very light rain conditions on a circuit that shouldn't have had any issues for it is a real crying shame, to be honest. I really do wish I had more to say to defend him, but it's just tricky on that front, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of people defending him, saying that this was an easy mistake, any driver could make this, and I guess I agree too. It's very unfortunate. It's a very unforgiving track, Zandvoort. Mistakes are very, very costly. However, it just felt like this was the last thing Lewis needed this weekend. He came in quite strong, I think. He looked really, really sharp in practice and in qualifying. All throughout Q1 and Q2, he had the better of his teammate, Charles Leclerc. Once they qualified sixth and seventh, it was a little bit lower down the grid than I was expecting, but still, I felt that there was pace in the car overall. There was very little in between Charles and Lewis in qualifying, less than a tenth between the two of them. So he was right up there. He looked a lot stronger. I think overall they were struggling with the pace a little bit throughout the race. I mean, prior to his crash, Lewis was kind of saying, I can't get past George here. But overall, I think there was a few positive takeaways, things to take away for Ferrari that weekend. Unfortunately, it was a disastrous weekend because we know then that Charles was also taken out of the race. Not his fault compared to Lewis's crash, but still a very, very, very unfortunate weekend for Charles. He had had a really, really good kind of couple of battles with George at one point, had a very, very impressive overtake earlier on in the race. Managed to keep it clean, kept it on track. I know some people were kind of saying that, he pushed it right off the track, and I don't think he was gaining an advantage, to be perfectly honest with you, and neither did any of the stewards as well. But I think it was a really, really impressive overtake. He kept it clean, and it was some good driving, a little bit of banging wheels, but it was great to see. Just unfortunately, not too long after he suffered that collision with Kimi Antonelli. What did you think of that
I
collision?
mean, just to lead on from what you said, yeah, great, great overtake from what we saw on a few angles afterwards. Everyone in the moment was thinking, wow, that was brilliant. He converted his car into a WRC thing and channeled his inner Colin McRae for a second. But then we looked at a couple other angles and it was like, were all four of those wheels over the line? Maybe, maybe not. It was pretty tough to tell considering he had basically merged cars with George. But yeah, it was really, really unfortunate to see him go out at the hands of Andrea Kimi Antonelli. It was a real shame. And is this the start of maybe a little bit of a three-pointed star conspiracy? We've had a Mercedes engine blow and ruin Lando's race. We've had an ex-Mercedes driver bin a Ferrari. And now we've had a Mercedes driver delete Charles Leclerc. So maybe there's something going on there. But all jokes aside, I think it really was a shame. And it kind of speaks to what we were saying about Andrea Kimi last week. He's under a lot of pressure, but it comes to a point where you need to know when to make these dangerous, well, not necessarily dangerous, but risky moves. And it was a risky move, a miscalculated one that ended up ending another driver's race, which is a real crying shame. And he ended up obviously with a penalty for that. And yeah, it's just a tricky thing to have to deal with, and really does not look great for Kimi, does it?
No, I mean, getting on to Kimi Antonelli and his performance, it was a poor move, to be perfectly honest with you. He went in far too aggressive. There was no way he was going to be able to turn the car in enough to give Charles enough space to fight that battle. It was just very disappointing to see, to be perfectly honest with you. I think I've been quite critical of Kimi Antonelli. I think he is a good driver. There is a good driver in there. His youth is definitely something that keeps cropping up again. Is he ready for this Mercedes drive? I mean, he came into the weekend. He didn't have a great qualifying either, which I think didn't help the situation. I think he put a lot of pressure on himself. He qualified 11th, whereas George was right up in 5th. He had a bit of work to do throughout the race. He was looking more positive, had made some moves up, and it just felt like he was pushing to make every single position he could, but that was just poorly judged, to be perfectly honest with you. And not only did it ruin Charles's race, it ruined his race. He received a 10-second penalty as a result of causing a collision, which we know is now the standard penalty in Formula One. And then he received a further 5-second penalty then for speeding in the pit lane, which I think probably came from his frustration in taking Charles out and already knowing that he was ruining his race, and that extra 5 seconds just ruined it again. So came away again pointless this weekend. I mean, it's very, very difficult to see how he picks himself up from here. I think obviously it's still very early days. He hasn't scored a point since the Canadian GP, where he did score that very impressive podium. And I know that there's been a few things out of his control. He's had 2 engine failures, which are completely out of his control. But it's not great to see such a long stretch not scoring any points, Lucas.
Yeah, I mean, it comes to a point wherein, as a driver, sometimes you have to know when you need to put in consistent, solid performances over shooting for every single gap you can see. And I know a lot of people are probably going to bring up that infamous Senna quote, but even still, when you are a driver as inexperienced as Antonelli is, and it's your first year in what is a front of the field team, you need to be pragmatic and you need to be strategic. And if you keep trying for everything without being able to discern between what is, a realistic, perhaps slightly risky move and what is a less realistic or arguably dangerous risky move, it's going to mess up your chances over the course of the championship. And that is what we've seen happen since Canada, despite those 2 engine failures and despite things that are out of his control. Sometimes what's out of his control is the car, and I think that's one thing that should always be within a driver's control. So yeah, there's definitely some improved decision making that needs to take place on his part, I reckon.
Yeah, he's got a lot of pressure on, I think, over the course of the rest of the season. I mean, there's tons of question marks around him heading into the season. Was he ready to join the Mercedes outfit? Look, I think as well he is a phenomenal driver in there. There is a very, very good driver. My criticism, obviously, last week was that I felt that his highs weren't high enough to justify his lows. I think that he came in incredibly hyped as well. Very difficult task to be that young, to jump into a team like Mercedes, which has had so much success over the years, and to replace someone like Lewis Hamilton, 7-time world champion. To step into that seat was always going to be massive pressure, and I think he has handled himself really, really well. It just feels like potentially this might have been a little bit rushed. Should he have had another year in F2? Should he have done that year in F3? It just feels like maybe it was underestimated what he was going to be facing. And I think we spoke about this last week, Lucas, but the regulation change next year is going to be massive. And I think it's going to be really big for Mercedes. They are pinning a lot on this. There's a lot of talk of how strong their power unit is going to be next year. If they have that championship contending car, they not only need George to be performing if George does indeed sign with Mercedes again, but they need Kimi right there with him too. And it's the consistency that is needed, and he hasn't had that season.
Yeah, I mean, going into this season with Kimi being dropped straight into the deep end at a top tier team, it does feel like a bit of a missed opportunity that he wasn't given a chance to start at somewhere like Williams or a feeder team like maybe even Aston Martin. Obviously, that would require Lance Stroll or Fernando Alonso to step aside, and it saddens me to say that it would probably be Alonso that would be the more likely candidate to step aside in that case, but that is all by the by. Being dropped into such a high-end team straight away like this is a lot of pressure, and it's something that perhaps he wasn't necessarily ready for. But even still, we've discussed last week that Toto loves a project, and to have replaced Lewis Hamilton, who kind of was his original project, is a big shoe to fill. So yeah, extra tricky on that front too. But yeah, going into next year, I feel like a lot of teams are going to be aiming to have a driver lineup that is solid, reliable, and a known quantity. It's part of what makes Cadillac's decision of taking on Bottas and Perez such a smart one, because they're proven, they're skilled, they're cool under pressure, and they are a known quantity in this sport. Whereas Antonelli is not quite that yet, is he? He's only had the 1 year in the sport and he's gone straight into Merc, and next year they're probably not going to have the highest degree of confidence in him as a driver, considering his performance thus far this year. So unless something turns around really majorly, I feel like might have a little bit of a wobbly start to the 2026 season if they can't put all their reliance on George. It's gonna be tough.
Yeah, I mean, I have to admire Mercedes in a way that they have stuck by their driver. I mean, I'm sure he's had lots of difficult conversations himself with the team already as well over the last few races. But they have been backing him pretty much throughout the season. You know, he is really young, as I said. There's a lot of pressure on him. I mean, even next week, it's his first home race in Monza. There will be tons of pressure to go with that too. I know, obviously, we had the race in Imola too, but Monza is kind of that extra step up. The Tifosi just go absolutely wild throughout Monza. And yes, of course, they're going to be backing the Ferraris, and there's pressure on people like Lewis Hamilton. But this is the first Italian driver we've had on the grid in quite some time. So that will all add to what he has to face next week. So whether he picks himself up and just tries to move forward and get a better result. But I think what you said, Lucas, is core to what the issue is with Kimi Antonelli. It's sometimes when you're an experienced driver, it's taking that step back and saying, what can we actually achieve this weekend? What can I actually get out of this weekend? And if it's just a P7, maybe that's what we should be happy with and walk away with, and a clean race and a solid haul of points instead of just ruining my race, essentially. You know, adding to that misery was that other 5 second penalty too, which I think just culminated in such a bad weekend for him. So I think he'll definitely need to learn to pick himself up from that. Also, just a side note on penalties, by the way, as well. Forgot to mention earlier that Lewis Hamilton will unfortunately be serving a 5 place grid penalty in Monza, which compounds his misery heading into the Italian GP weekend. He obviously received that penalty for failing to slow under yellow flag
Right.
conditions, but I think Lewis and Kimi will have tough weekends heading into the Italian GP.
Yeah, it's the Tifosi have always been a little bit tough on Lewis. I mean, for a number of reasons before his Ferrari tenure, but now that he is in that horse car, sorry, red Ferrari, whatever, there's going to be even more pressure yet, and to have his first race at Monza in front of what is the highest attendance by Tifosi of any track on the calendar is going to be really tough for him, both as from a performance perspective, having a 5 place grid penalty is going to have to work a lot harder to get back up the field, and from a mentality perspective, because it's arguably a little bit embarrassing to be starting so far back. It doesn't really matter how high he qualifies. Is he going to be starting within the top 10 in that car? I don't know, unless something miraculous happens. As for Kimi, yeah, again, another tough one, isn't it? I mean, going into that race, it's going to be his first race in front of, again, so much Tifosi. And to be sort of the inverse of what Lewis was in the Mercedes at the time he last raced there, it's going to be tough for both of them. And I really hope that the pressure doesn't add onto Antonelli's performance any further than it already has. Because if he's already making the kinds of mistakes he is in the Netherlands, where I don't think there are many Ferrari fans, I think we know what the majority contingent is over there. Having all of those screaming fans and all those expectations, especially in front of all of those fans, it's going to be a lot of pressure on him as a rookie in a new top performing team at a track which is essentially his home race. It's going to be a lot of pressure. Let's see how he handles it.
Yeah, and speaking of rookies, Lucas, of course we have to talk about Isack Hadjar. What a weekend it was for him, up on the podium there. First podium Racing Bulls have had in quite some time. What a performance from the Frenchman. Just really, really impressive. He qualified P4, obviously. Pretty much managed to plant his car throughout the entirety of the race. He was not letting go of that position. Kept his cool throughout all the safety car conditions, and then, of course, managed to inherit the podium after Lando had the DNF. But still, what a performance from Isack Hadjar. I mean, is it time to dub him the Rookie of the Year already?
I think this performance puts forward a pretty arguable case for that. It was genuinely phenomenal, his performance throughout the whole weekend. To be qualified that high. Before the race even started, we had a lot of people asking, does this car really have the right to be this far up the grid? And, a lot of people would argue no, but a car is only half the equation here. Isack put on a hell of a performance. At the start of the race, I mean, obviously he was described as a bit of a cork in the bottle, trapping Charles Leclerc and, going around relatively slowly compared to all the other drivers. And yes, I know Zandvoort is a relatively difficult track to overtake at, historically speaking, but he turned that car into a bit of a double-decker bus and put on his best Fernando Alonso impression because nobody was getting past him. There were battles going on behind. And to be honest, he's just him bunching up the field probably aided the excitement of the race overall. So thank you, Isack, for your incredible performance. And for aiding the drama a little bit, and to keep a cool head through 2 safety car restarts, not change position throughout the entire race, is phenomenally impressive for a rookie. And I think that comparison between him and Antonelli is really quite damning on Antonelli's part, to have a driver in a junior team perform better than he did at the end of the day. I think that's a real shame, but not to detract from Isaac's performance. That was genuinely amazing. Genuinely.
Yeah, it was absolutely stunning. I mean, as you said, when you're bunching up the field like that, I think when you're a driver's experience of Fernando Alonso, I think he sometimes takes a bit of sick pleasure from holding up that many cars. But definitely Isack was under pressure throughout that, and it was interesting to hear him talk actually in the cool down room. You could hear him saying he was trying different things to shut the door pretty much on every lap. He was thinking of new ways to just make sure that no one was getting past him, and I think that's the mark of a driver who can just really keep his cool and hold on. And I mean, yes, he did inherit the podium, but what a deserved podium for him. I was so
100%.
delighted to just see him up there, and I think he is such a promising young talent in the sport. I mean, we go back to Australia. Look how poorly the season started for him, crashing out on that opening lap. I mean,
Yeah.
he's a very open guy, I think, Isack Hadjar. He's admittedly said that he's a very nice guy. I think he hasn't come in with some of the aggression that other drivers have come in, which I think most drivers need to have as well. He's kind of come in with a very friendly face in the paddock. Everyone seems to like him, and I think something like that could have destroyed his confidence throughout the year. However, he has just completely done a complete 180 and just been so impressive, not just this weekend, but weekend in and weekend out. I mean, that car is not too bad. That Racing Bulls is quite a bit of pace on it as well. His teammate Liam Lawson also had a pretty impressive qualifying, although his race didn't shake out the same way, which we'll get to as well. But just back to Isack Hadjar and his performance in the Racing Bulls. I mean, I guess the big question is he ready, or is he the person to eye up for that second Red Bull seat? Obviously, Red Bull had a decent weekend overall. Max qualified third, finished the race second, obviously, after Lando DNF'd. He looked pretty good over the weekend, but the pace just wasn't there, I think, to ever take the win or pole position. But I think Max came away just thinking, yeah, look, it was a fine weekend. We've learned a few things from it, and happy to be on the podium again. I mean, Yuki Tsunoda managed to get back up with the points after a not great qualifying, but I mean, Isack Hadjar, is he ready to take that step up? We saw Helmut Marko praising him very highly after. I know that Marko isn't the de facto decision on these things, especially since Horner departed as well. There might be some differences in how those decisions are made, but what do you think? One, do you think Isack should be in that team? And also, is that a good decision for Isack?
Yeah, that's the thing, isn't it? I mean, I feel like we have this conversation every year when it comes to Red Bull's second seat, don't we? I mean, sometimes multiple times a year, which is fun, especially this year. But I think obviously we have to see how the rest of the season shakes out for Isack, and for Yuki for that matter. But I personally, if I were him, I don't think I would want to be boosted up to that Red Bull seat so quickly, especially not mid-season. I definitely don't think that's even on the cards. But what will be interesting to see how it plays out is in the post-Horner era, how those decisions are made. I mean, obviously, he wasn't the be-all and end-all of moving drivers around at that team. Helmut had a big part to play in that too. But even still, will they be as fickle as they have been for the last nigh on decade now, I suppose? But yeah, I think Isack definitely has the raw pace for it. It's just A, the chemistry with the team, B, how well he gets along with Max, and C, whether or not he's ready for a car that everybody seems to think is made specifically for Verstappen. So yeah, it's going to be tough. I think in current hardware, he's doing brilliantly. I don't think he'll be moved up next year simply because of that reason. with the new regulations coming through. I think people want to have known quantities at the team. But perhaps 2027, maybe, I think would probably be the best bet for Isaac.
I think I disagree with you there slightly, Lucas. I
Oh,
think 26, he could potentially be in that car. I mean, look, he's downplayed it all weekend. I mean, he was noticeably a bit more tight-lipped about it, though, when asked by journalists. Before, he
mm,
kind of said, oh, like, I'm not really ready. I want to take my time. This time, he kind of was just avoiding the question a little bit. What I think the reason for potentially signing him in 26 might work better is not having that known quantity, I think, isn't. I mean, it is important, but it isn't as important because we've got a whole new regulation cycle. And I guess one of the main criticisms with Red Bull and the second driver is that the DNA of that car has been designed towards Max's driving style. Now, whether you agree with that or not is by the by. But this will be a reset for two new drivers, and they will get plenty of feedback from two new drivers and be able to develop a car for two drivers as opposed to one driver. Um, and extract different kind of areas of performance with them. Now, Isaac doesn't have the same experience as someone like Yuki giving that technical feedback as well, so I think that is something to consider as well. I think too, Yuki didn't have a bad weekend overall. I think his main issue he needs to get on top of is his qualifying performance, really. I mean, he was out in Q2 again, had a decent recovery and managed to make it back into the points. He also had a bit of a throttle issue as well. I believe that they were saying on the engine that he didn't have throttle up to about 40%. So once he would accelerate, he wouldn't actually get drive until they'd hit that 40% mark. And then all of a sudden the car would jostle forward. And he had to get used to that under safety car conditions and then finish out the race, which he managed to do and finish in the points. So I think he does need to be commended this weekend. And there has been some improvement. And I think that Laurent Mekies, as I said, is a good man to kind of back Yuki throughout the year. I agree, mid-season driver changes for Red Bull, one, don't make a huge amount of sense. And I just don't think we'll do the team any favors, just given how chaotic their driver lineups have been over the last 2 years as well. I mean, we already have had a mid-season driver lineup with, we keep forgetting that. Liam
yeah.
Lawson drove for Red Bull for two races as well. So, but I do think actually 26 could be the perfect year for Hadjar to join the team. I guess the issue there is you're going up against Max Verstappen. I mean, that's always the one thing that seems to crop up. Are you ready to face the mental challenge of going up against Max, who has arguably the best driver on the grid? And also, I think the issue with Verstappen is as well is he has had so much success with that team as an organization. He only knows that organization, and it's
True.
difficult to step up to that organization and be that number two. And I think that that will be another big challenge if Hadjar is picked. Marco, as I said, has been massively praising him. I think if it was up to Marco, he'd probably stick him in tomorrow. We know that Marco tends to see one really strong performance and then on a whim decides that's the guy I want. You know, it happened with Nick DeVries a couple of years ago. He managed to score that point in Monza. Horner was famously against that decision, and I believe that that was probably the correct decision at the time. But I think that, you know, Marco will be campaigning to try and get Hadjar into that full-time Red Bull seat next year.
Yeah, I mean, he wants what he thinks is the best driver for the job. So, you know, whoever performs best is probably who he thinks is that is going to be. But yeah, it's going to be a difficult decision on that front. And you are right in that with the whole known quantity argument, Max Verstappen is Red Bull and Red Bull is Max Verstappen, especially at this point since the Mercedes rumors have been quelled a little bit. Um, so yeah, I think regardless of who they decide to go into that second seat, they will have solid, reliable feedback from a driver that they know and understand. So yeah, there is argument to say that Isaac will be jumped up next year, but if I were him, I would be very careful how I take that decision and with and what I do with that seat because it's going to take some time and he needs to temper his expectations in the same way that Kimi does, to be honest. And just bide his time. It's like entering any new job. Spend the first 1 to 2 months just sitting and listening and doing what you're told before you start making any rash decisions.
I think as
Um,
well on that, I think it would be really interesting to see how does that decision play out. I mean, if Red Bull say you're going in the first team next year, can you say no? Can you turn around and say no? I'm staying with Racing Bulls. Is that how it works?
I
I'd be really
mean,
interested to see what the inner workings with the Red Bull contracts are.
so would I, to be honest. I imagine there's a man that comes along with a pin and he pricks your thumb, and then you have to put a dab of blood on the dotted line. Uh, but in all seriousness, I mean, if you wanted to say no, don't sign, don't sign. I think it would be unprecedented, and I think it would arguably be a bit of a silly decision not to take that promotion because Lord knows when that door is going to open again, and especially considering in the life cycle of a Formula One driver, you want to be taking every opportunity that comes your way because time is finite in any sport for that matter. So yeah, if it were to come his way, he would and should take it. It's just that once he does, how he conducts himself in that position is going to be a difficult challenge of balancing impressing the team with keeping his own sanity, I suppose, and being really realistic about his and the team's expectations of him moving forwards.
Yeah, I guess regardless of what your personal decision might be, I think choosing to stay in the second team would just kind of put a mark of what kind of driver you are. It would
Mm,
kind of be openly saying, like, I'm not the kind of driver who wants to win championships because even though there's a massive question mark around all the teams next year, but in particular Red Bull, especially with a new engine supplier next year as well, their own engine program, things like that. But that being said, they're the team that has won championships in the past. And for you to say I'm sticking with a team that one doesn't realistically have any ambitions of winning any championships
mm.
would be pretty damning. So I think you're right there, Lucas. I mean, it would be madness to not make that move up. So we'll have to watch that storyline very, very closely. A few other things just wanted to talk about over the weekend. It was pretty chaotic race, Lucas. I mean, there was kind of blotches of rain here and there that didn't massively affect the race as much as I think people were expecting, but good few kind of collisions and things. One of which I want to speak about Liam Lawson and Carlos Sainz. I mean, bit of a pity for Liam Lawson. He qualified quite well over the weekend in eighth place, finished the race outside of the points after suffering a collision with Sainz, which pretty much destroyed both of their races. But I think the big talking point was Sainz receiving a 10-second penalty for it. I mean, they both received a puncture. It was a little bit of a collision. Okay, it was a bit of a racing incident in my mind, but Sainz was very, very unhappy about that collision. What did you make of it?
I'm inclined to agree, to be honest. From where I was sitting, it looked a lot like a racing incident. I'd say the consequences were about equal for both drivers with regards to the damage received and damage dealt. To have that 10-second penalty applied in the context of the rest of the race, I feel like could have been a little bit harsh. At the end of the day, races were ruined for both drivers, so I do understand wanting to penalise one for before the other, or put assigning more fault to one than the other, but it is a very much blanket penalty, isn't it? I mean, we saw the same penalty for both Kimi and for Carlos, which is difficult. The ramifications of those two incidents were different. I would say that Antonelli got off a little bit easier than Carlos did. But even still, to see both of them receive a 10-second penalty, while I understand it is consistent for those two, is more severe for one than it is for the other in terms of who was at fault. Now, there was also inconsistency within this race in that there was no penalty or no further action taken for Charles Leclerc's somewhat dubious overtake on George Russell during the early portions of the race. That did cause a collision. A driver was arguably outside of the confines of the track to gain an advantage, and yet we saw no further action from the stewards. So it's difficult to balance who is at fault versus who gets a penalty, and there's not only inconsistency from race to race, but to have that level of inconsistency within a single race is somewhat more difficult to swallow.
Yeah, I mean, this has been a recurring talking point of the last few years in Formula One, some of the
Mm.
stewarding decisions. And look, I mean, I'm hesitant to criticize stewards too much. They are voluntary, of course. They give up their time and their weekend to be there. But when it is crucial to race results, it just does feel like it's not professional. It feels like, I think the argument to have paid stewards every weekend and consistent stewards every weekend would make a lot more sense. People who know track in, track out, they're not going to interpret the rules in any way differently as well, I think would be a big step for Formula One to take. I think this weekend is the perfect example. I mean, you've mentioned Charles's overtake. I mean, one of my main criticisms is how kind of strict we are on some of the regulations and rules as well. I like to just see two cars racing, and if that means someone going off the track a little bit, like let them just race. You know, track limits is the bane of my existence, I think, watching Formula One. And I'm sure it's the bane of every driver's existence as well, watching Formula One. And some drivers are kind of better at policing it than others. We know George is always on the radio as soon as it looks like someone has gone over the white line. But I think this incident with Carlos just really, identifies the biggest issue with the lack of consistency with stewarding. I think it was very harsh on Carlos. I think there shouldn't have been a penalty at all. And I appreciate that the minimum penalty is now 10 seconds after for causing a collision. But if anything, I would have said it was slightly more Liam's fault in that situation. But I don't think it warranted a penalty. It was a racing incident. They bumped wheels, and as you said, they both had similar outcomes. They both had punctures, they both had to pit, and that was pretty evident in how both their race results were slightly skewed then because Carlos had that penalty to serve. And I think as well, when these things happen further down the grid, it's easier to turn a bit of a blind eye to them and just move on to the next race. Had this decision been made for a win or a podium or in a close championship fight between two drivers, I think there would be a lot more questions to be answered
Oh,
by
it
the
would be uproar.
yeah. But I think that this is the problem, though. It needs to be consistently applied all throughout the grid, whether you're in P19 and P20 or P1 and 2. This is the core of the issue as well. So, yeah, I think something that really the FIA really
It
needs to
it
take.
does need to be addressed properly, doesn't it? But speaking of P20, someone started in P20 yesterday or the day before at this point, and then came out all the way up the table at P7. A remarkably strong and dare I say a little bit of a rare performance from Lance Stroll to be so high up the field after qualifying bum last. So what did you think on that one?
It was interesting. I mean, terrible start to the weekend, obviously crashing out in FP2 or FP1, I think it was, and then also crashing out in qualifying, failing to set a time. I mean, it looked really, really poor for Lance heading into the weekend. But a very good recovery drive, I have to say. I think Lance generally tends to be a bit better on Sundays. I think his race is always a little bit better than his qualifying performance. However, he doesn't make life easier for himself. Like if he had just managed to set a time, maybe he would have been even further up the grid. I think he got a little bit lucky with some of the safety cars too, and how Aston Martin had played the strategy. That being said, I need to commend the team. They played it really well. Alonso obviously felt he was really hard done by because he had pitted right before the safety car. Very, very unlucky on Alonso's part. But credit where credit's due. It was an impressive drive from Lance. He took home a good haul of points for Aston Martin. I just think, it goes back to the consistency thing as well. It's nice to see Lance get a good result, and I think that there is a good driver in there. But
Mm.
my God, just set a time. Just set a
Yeah,
qualifying
it's
time.
yeah. One does not just come to Sunday and run away with it. You have to, put in the work the day before, qualify high up enough in the grid to make sure you're competitive. And yes, he did manage to turn it around to a single digit finishing position, which is impressive. But you have to think exactly what you said. Like, if he had maybe even qualified P7, I know that might be slightly wishful thinking, but if he had, then maybe he might have actually finished P6 or P5 or, had an easier weekend, which, would be nice to see him do consistently. And yes, I know that there is somewhere in there is a good driver, but God, I wish he would show it to us a little more often than he has been recently, or since the beginning, really.
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested to hear what you think as well because Aston's pace all weekend looked quite good, to be honest with you.
Hmm.
They kind of lost their way, I felt, last year, had a difficult start to this year, but it looks like they're on a much better track. Obviously, next year, I mean, there's a lot of
Oof.
eyes on them next year. We mentioned this last week. Obviously, Adrian Newey designing their first car. New engine supplier next year. They'll be switching over to Honda, which have had huge success with Red Bull over the years. But I think it's weekends like this that make me think, what the hell are we going to do with Lance next year if he's performing like this? And they have this absolutely dominant car. They cannot rely on one driver. I mean, maybe they will. Maybe they're fine with that. Maybe they're happy for one driver to absolutely run away with it. I think it's frustrating with me because, and I do like Lance. I do. I think he gets a lot of hate, and as I said, I think there's a good driver in there, and I think he's not the worst guy for sure. However, I do feel that better drivers have been sacked for less over the years, and it's probably a bit harsh for me to be bringing this up now when he actually had a good performance this weekend. But I feel two crashes over the course of two sessions just
It's
isn't
not good
really.
enough in a single weekend, is it? I I mean, I fundamentally, as a person, I quite like Lance. I think he's completely harmless. I think he's really chill. He's one of the only drivers on the grid that will, sit and chat with a little boy for hours on end, which I think is completely adorable. But fundamentally, drivers are here for one thing, and that is to drive. And to see performances like this more regularly would be lovely. I think Lawrence Stroll, who is quite instrumental in the building of this team, has spent the last few years, probably since the pink Mercedes era, trying to buy the best team on the grid. And next year he might actually have done it with, obviously with hiring Adrian Newey and changing manufacturers for engines to Honda and all of this sort of thing, poaching little bits of talent from all across the grid to build his infinity gauntlet of Formula One winning. Which, might actually happen. It might actually happen. Sad as it is, a lot of this sport is about who can afford what. And it's part of what's made Haas's struggles so big. It's part of what's made Williams' struggles so big, is the fact that at the end of the day, money is king. Cash is king. And yes, a lot of the price cap rules have tried to bring teams closer together, but there is still a bit of disparity between the top end and the bottom end teams. That's just the fact of the matter. Lawrence Stroll is brute forcing it a little bit, and 2026 is going to be very telling to see, how much money can one throw at talent and walk away with a winning car. So if that does turn out to be the case, at the end of the day, I think he's probably done it all for his son. So I don't think Lance is going anywhere anytime soon. I think we've been having this discussion for years and years at this point, probably since he came into the sport to begin with. But he's going to be sticking around. Whether or not he can stack up to that performance, I do not know. I mean, I've got an idea, but I can't say for sure. And I think it's going to be very, very interesting, especially to see how long Alonso wants to stick around and arguably carry the team. We shall see in due course.
Yeah, I'm sure we could do a whole podcast on this topic, Lucas. Anyway,
People
so
have.
yeah. Thank you very much for listening, everybody. We're back again next week for more action in Monza, which we're very excited about. Make sure you subscribe to the channel and head over to crash.net to stay up to date with all the latest Formula One news. And until next time, keep it on the racing line.
Ta-ra.